Good evening and welcome to this John Brademas Center event. I'm Kyle Strickland, the Roosevelt Institute's Deputy Director of Race and Democracy, and I'm thrilled to be speaking with you today, as well as with Joseph Fishkin and William Forbath, the authors of the Anti-Oligarchy Constitution, about this important topic. Now, Russian oligarchs have dominated headlines in recent weeks, but tonight's guests remind us that oligarchy is also an American problem. Income and wealth inequality are more extreme in the United States than almost any other developed country, and this trend shows no signs of abating. You don't have to look much further than the impact of money in our politics and civic life to see how this kind of inequality subverts our democratic institutions and free press. In their important new book, Joseph Fishkin and William Forbath argue that the Constitution has and should continue to play a pivotal role in shaping claims of justice and equality. For them, American oligarchy is not just an economic, social, or political problem, it's a constitutional problem. So please join me in welcoming Joseph Fishkin and William Forbath. In addition to writing this important book, Joseph is a professor of law at the UCLA School of Law, and William is the Lloyd M. Benson Chair and Associate Dean of Research at the University of Texas Austin School of Law, as well as Professor of History at UT Austin. We look forward to taking your questions later on. So just kind of moderator, feel free to add them via the question and answer box, and we'll get to your questions towards the end, audience questions at around 6:45. But before we dive in to your book, I need to ask you both about the draft opinion overturning Roe, which was leaked last week. What are the implications for the legitimacy of the court if this draft opinion becomes an official court ruling? Joey, feel free to open with that.
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. This is great. Yeah, it's a good starting point because I think this draft opinion already, and then particularly if it becomes the real opinion, has pointed out to a lot of Americans who might not have been paying attention that the Supreme Court is certainly a product of politics. Political movements have been fighting for many decades on the right to get this result, and less obviously for a lot of other results. The constitutional politics, what we call constitutional politics, which is people making arguments out in politics about what the Constitution means and should say, that's happening on the right, and it's been happening for many decades now. And the Supreme Court is never, completely separate from or above politics, even though sometimes the justices like to talk about, we just call the balls and strikes. They're not actually the referees here. They are, in a complicated way, because they're different from politicians, they do law, but they're part of our constitutional politics too. And so this ruling, which simply because of personnel changes on the court will completely reverse decades of settled precedent that a lot of Americans counted on, I think it might have the result that a lot of Americans who are not on the right start to pay more attention to constitutional politics and maybe fight with, to try to get their elected representatives and their senators to push back against the court, which is actually a big part of the work that we're doing in the book. We're trying to recover a kind of constitutional politics outside the courts. And I think, that may happen as a result of this disastrous, tragic thing that is about to befall the United States.
Thanks so much for that. And I think that brings me to this question around, in your book specifically, you both argue that the Constitution imposes a duty on the US government and our representatives to fight oligarchy and ensure that wealth is broadly shared among Americans. And so why do you think this is so important, and why is now the time to fight for this?
Well, it's important in ways that it's always been important, that we'd long understood and have begun to lose, or have sort of over the past few decades lost a grip on the way in which economic inequality isn't just a problem about fairness, right? Or even just a problem about making good on the American promise of opportunity. It's also a political problem that it long was understood that economic inequality, right, opens onto and inevitably generates political inequality. And political inequality, right, is a sort of starkly constitutional problem in a way that for most Americans, economic inequality doesn't automatically register and land in one's mind as that's a constitutional problem. But once we recall the ways in which economic and political equality and inequality are just inextricable, and for most of our history, Americans understood that they were, in their sort of entangled nature, they were a constitutional issue. Right? It's important to remember because we're in a moment of great crisis about political and economic inequality, and only one side in the battle is fighting, right, the constitutional part of that battle in a clear and vivid way. So it's important to remember, and it's important to remember that these fights have always gone on chiefly outside of the courts. At least the part of the fight that's saying a broad distribution of wealth and power, a broad distribution of economic power is essential, because as you mentioned a moment ago, that's a legislative piece of work. Courts can say, no, don't redistribute, but really only lawmakers and administrative, right, branches of government can do the work of redistribution. So it's really, right, fighting with one's hands tied to forget that the legislature, right, is a prime mover, and for our point of view, the prime mover in making good on constitutional commitments.
There's a lot of history in this book, and I'll just add that, you know, the moment that we're in now definitely reminds me a lot of the Gilded Age a century ago that we spend a lot of time on in the book, both because we have, as Will was saying, a similar kind of radical divergence in fortune and crisis of inequality, but also because we have a radical Supreme Court that is using a variety of doctrines across different spheres in ways that make that inequality worse.
That's really, really helpful in terms of your context and framing when you're speaking to kind of this reminder of the Gilded Age. And it brings me to a question around oligarchy, right? And so how do you all define oligarchy, and why do you describe it as the threat that it is?
So I think for us, oligarchy, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, rule by a handful of people. It's about too much political and economic power being concentrated in too few hands. And framed in that way, it's a problem that the framers of the Constitution were very conscious of and aware of. They thought that if you're going to have a republic, you're going to need a broad distribution of political power and economic power. Now, they may not have thought that you needed nearly as broad a distribution of, you know, the right to vote as we would see as totally necessary today for a republic, but they did see that you needed a much broader distribution of political power and the right to vote than any of the societies that had come before them. And so part of what we see in the contrast between a republic and an oligarchy, which is present from the beginning of our constitutional tradition and was central to the fight over Reconstruction, where the Reconstruction Republicans saw what they were doing as trying to overthrow the slave power that was a special kind of oligarchy, where the plantation owners had too much economic and political power over everyone else, particularly the slaves. The Republicans saw, I think, that that oligarchy and our Republican, small r Republican Constitution are not compatible. And so that's the kind of deep thread that we're picking up on. Obviously, you know, oligarchy is a matter of degree. It's not a question of, you know, next week we're going to be an oligarchy instead of a democracy. It's a question of where we are as between these poles, and it's important to the future of our Constitution, we think, to press away from too much power being in too few hands, and particularly because, as Willie was saying earlier, the economic power and the political power are mutually reinforcing.
No, I think it's a helpful point, especially in the sense of people separating the economy and political power, separating law and the economy, and important to really frame those issues together. A lot of progressives at times talk about making the arguments that something might be good policy, but there might be this argument that you're framing around, which is framing arguments in terms of the Constitution. So, and why should progressives frame arguments in terms of the Constitution? And, doesn't that risk ceding some of the power to the courts, and particularly in today's jurisprudence, those who might not be looking to implement policies that advance equity? But why would you make that argument about framing it in terms of the Constitution?
Partly because once you have such a dramatically activist court, right, which is making, right, strong constitutional claims, not only about abortion rights and race equality and gender equality, and how thin their vision of it is, but making strong constitutional claims against broad social insurance, right? Weaving into their law sort of what otherwise might be simply a libertarian thread in our politics, but has become a thick strand in our constitutional law, right? If those claims on the court's part and their patrons in politics, right, go unanswered, then one is ceding valuable ground for as long as, right, we're not political consultants, so we're not here to tell progressive, right, politicians and opinion makers and party leaders, right, how to pitch things. But we think over the long run, right, bringing back a whole kind of world of constitutional claims about these issues of social insurance, worker empowerment, right, as matters, even banking and currency, were all matters for constitutional claim making on all sides. But now our side has fallen silent. All we say all the time is the Constitution doesn't really speak to these things. But that, right, becomes, right, that's the real ceding away of ground for as long as some important swath of Americans, right, think the Constitution matters. And if they think that all the Constitution has to say about this is something that sounds very contrary to the progressive program, we think that's a loss, and that the peril. It's too late in the day to say let's keep economic policy off the constitutional table, because the court and the right in politics as well as in, right, litigation has already put the Constitution in play.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, like, we can imagine a world. I can imagine a world in which, the Constitution is just not something that we have to argue about when it comes to economic matters. And it's easy to imagine that world because liberals have been imagining that world for, 60, 70 years now, but they've been the only ones imagining that world. And we haven't actually been living in that world. And actually, I'm not sure it's such a great world anyway, because, it's not that democratic, actually, to say that. I mean, it sounds fine to say, oh, well, the courts will just stay out, but they never really stay out. There are always boundaries. There are always things that courts do intervene and do. And if we say the courts are just kind of expert guardians to whom we should defer, and in politics, we should just make our policy arguments and not talk about the Constitution because that's for the courts, that's a particular liberal way of thinking that in the book, we kind of trace the emergence of it. It came about, I think, in part in response to the desegregation fight after Brown, where Southern racists were attacking the Supreme Court. Liberals were defending it and saying, you have to obey the court. You have to do what the court says. But this way of thinking has not, in the end, served liberals very well, both because, as Willie says, it's very one-sided. Conservatives have been making their constitutional arguments in politics. And also because it kind of makes what are really things that have always been core constitutional arguments, at least always until the last half century or whatever, have always been core constitutional arguments that progressives have made, that we show in our book were kind of a major part of constitutional politics for the first 2/3 of American history. It sort of takes those arguments and neuters them by taking away their core constitutional substance. And you start having Supreme Court justices saying things like, instead of saying the right to organize is a central important right in the Constitution, they say things like Congress might have wanted to promote labor peace, so it's okay to have some labor laws, and this is not really the full argument. We're leaving a lot on the table.
It's really helpful, and I think is a reminder in terms of conversations around race, or these conversations, quote unquote, the culture wars, where some seem to not have any arguments whatsoever and avoid discussion for fear of division. But what happens then is you see those arguments, you see the ground towards that. So it brings me to the point. You guys are not political consultants, but you do have some good advice, some good practical advice in this. So what can our representatives in government actually do to stop oligarchy and preserve what you all refer to as, quote, democracy of opportunity?
Well, one thing, there are many things Congress and the executive branch can do, but make no mistake, they need a reasonably durable majority, right? But if we can mobilize such a majority, and perhaps these ideas will help it, but they can pass the quite broad-gauged new labor law reforms that are on the table already, that have been passed through the House. And one of the things that struck Joey and me about the it's called the PRO Act, Protecting the Right to Organize Act, is that already the lawmakers in that space say these are constitutional rights. Mm-hmm. The right to engage in broad strikes and boycotts, which labor law presently outlaws, and to the extent it doesn't, the court's constitution most surely does. So repealing these limitations that marked the defeat of the most dramatic elements of the New Deal, that rolled back the New Deal in the name of an old, anti-labor constitution, repealing those measures, and then, making claims that we once more do have a right to strike and organize, in engaging in broad actions across workplaces, across employers, so that labor once more, has power in the political and economic sphere to make, stronger demands. Meanwhile, there are many other kinds of measures Congress can do, and will surely meet resistance when it does so. I'll cede to Joey some time to talk about, say, the election law reform, where it seems as though the court has thrown up some really insuperable barriers.
Sure. Well, yeah, labor law is a great place to start. So is election law, and particularly the financing of campaigns. That's an area where oligarchy, you really see it. We can directly translate economic power now into political power because we have such a wild sort of open system of wealthy people being able to fund entire campaigns. The Supreme Court has left some doors open, which Congress needs to use, and also states need to use state legislators, things like public financing of elections so that you don't have to be super wealthy or have wealthy friends to run for office. But beyond elections, I mean, there's a lot of, much of the spectrum of economic issues fits into the story in our book. So we need antitrust enforcement that kind of pivots away from this 1970s Robert Bork idea that antitrust is all about just consumer prices. And instead, we try to actually stop companies from becoming so powerful and dominant politically and economically that they pose a threat to democracy. And there's some agitation around this. Some of it's sort of focused on the tech giants, but there's a lot of energy around this change. And this is one area where the Biden administration, through personnel, has certainly moved things. But we argue in the book. I mean, a lot of the past fights about oligarchy from 100 years ago were about taxes and wealth. We think we need some sort of mechanism, whether it's a wealth tax or a better estate tax or various different ways you can do it, to tax dynastic wealth so that we don't have a kind of hereditary aristocracy. This is an idea that Thomas Jefferson understood, but it's also an idea that takes on a different edge today when we look at it through a racial lens and see that what's going on is, concentrations of wealth that are tracking who had a multi-generational chance to build up wealth and who had segregation and was blocked from getting those opportunities before. So there's a lot of work that Congress and state legislatures can do there, also to sort of more broadly increase access to education and access to capital. It's interesting, by the time we finish this book, the really kind of explosion of interest in student debt forgiveness hadn't yet occurred, but actually fits in very well with the story that we tell there. So anyway, there's a lot, and all of these things, as Willie was saying, these are all things that you can argue are good policy, and also that are certainly going to face legal assault in the courts. And part of what you need in court is arguments that say, not only are these measures, a good idea, but there's also a kind of constitutional impetus behind them, which should overcome some of the constitutional objections. Not that courts will buy that, but at least it sets up the necessary fight between the legislatures and the courts.
Yeah. So to be clear, what the book envisions in just the right level of detail, right? Which is to say, there's plenty of particulars, but it moves along, is sort of recurring battles in which, in virtue of laying sort of some constitutional claims of our own on the table, when the court strikes down a wealth tax or a labor law reform or a campaigns finance reform, and the time comes for Congress to push back against the courts, Congress is doing so in the name of a constitutional principle that sits against the court's claims, right? So the court will almost surely, if we're fortunate enough to have progressive majorities and enact measures like this, at least one, right, or two iterations of them will be struck down or severely gutted in the name of plutocratic constitutional ideas that are already afoot on the court and have a mooring in the court. And it'll be necessary to enact measures that essentially make credible threats to the court that we're, slowly going to whittle down your power if need be.
No, and actually, when you bring up the point around these majorities might pass good policy, good legislation that gets struck down, the question I would have then is, are there lessons we can learn from past constitutional politics, this frame constitutional politics that can be applied and learn from here in today's moment into the future?
The court packing plan of Roosevelt, right, is so often pointed to by sophisticated liberals as a defeat and a failure and a turning point when the New Deal began to ebb. We think that misses the point and misses the lesson. We think that at the time in the arena of public appearances, what the people thought was happening, Roosevelt's court packing plan was drawing a line in the sand, and the court stepped back. The court, it was the court that drew back, made switches. Even before Roosevelt had the opportunity to appoint new justices, the court packing plan succeeded, in pushing the key members on the court to uphold the central New Deal measures that were on the chop block. It's true the New Deal lost steam, but not because of the court packing plan. That's just simply an historical mistake, which I won't unpack right now, as it were, but it's well explained in the book. So it's one lesson from the past, that making clear, robust, substantive constitutional arguments, which Roosevelt and the New Dealers made on the radio, in their election campaigns, in the halls of Congress, in press conferences, not saying the court is violating precedent, not saying the court is going too far, but saying here are the constitutional reasons, substantive ones, why we need these measures that the court is striking down, and why we've waited for the court to sort of see the light, and it's refused, and now we have to take sterner measures, but in the name of not nonpartisanship, but of substantive commitments that Americans had sort of voted to uphold in the elections.
It's helpful. Joe, do you have anything to add in terms of some of the lessons we can learn on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree very strongly with Willie that that's the biggest single one, because frankly, what we're setting up today, we're living in the early years of another kind of far right court, similar to the court that existed before the switch, before the New Deal convinced the court to back off. This is, I think, a very strong parallel. But I guess the other thing I'll add is about Reconstruction, which is one of the things that was initially hard to wrap my head completely around as I was, doing part of the research for this book, and then eventually really understood, is that, a lot of what the Reconstruction Republicans thought they were doing when they were ending slavery and providing that everyone would have the same privileges and immunities and that there would be equal protection of the laws and all that stuff, they didn't expect that the way that was going to get enforced was primarily through the courts. They were enacting language that they thought was going to be enforced by them passing laws through Congress, through legislation. That's the method. That's the kind of mechanism. And that, I think, is useful to remember when today you have these very kind of very strong, put it that way, pushing the envelope claims of sort of judicial exclusivity over constitutional interpretation that you're going to see a lot more of coming from the right, because the court is the branch that their side has the firmest grip on at the moment. And those claims are very ahistorical. It does not all follow from Marbury versus Madison. The court had Marbury, the court was doing reviews of Constitution, the court had its role in the constitutional system, and it's always been an important role. But political parties, through politics, can change the meaning of existing parts of the Constitution, can enact legislation that's aimed at enforcing the Constitution. So anyway, I do think that's also a helpful perspective, if not the same way as the court packing plan, a practical lesson. It's at least useful to understand that part of how our system is supposed to work by the lights of the architects of the modern version of that system, which is the Reconstruction Republicans. How our system is supposed to work is that the Constitution makes a lot of demands on how our society is supposed to be if we're going to have a republic that operates how it should. And a lot of those demands, the only way to meet them is through new legislation that responds to the conditions and challenges of its time. And so, in the same way that in the New Deal, they needed new laws that dealt with a new world of industrialization and mass, democracy and large corporations and everything that was new in the 20th century. We may need new laws again today, but this is still something that Congress has a constitutional duty and obligation to do. It's not just a question of what is Congress allowed to do. So anyway, I think that's a important piece to take from this story.
Sure, certainly, and I think you bring to mind the moment we're in now. It's hard to believe that it's been almost 2 years since 2020, and over 2 years at least, in the most devastating pandemic that we are still experiencing today, and more than a century, a national reckoning with systemic racism and other notable social movements to push for the dismantling of systemic institutions and advocates for reform. Do you believe the moment we're in has provided the momentum needed to actually reconstruct our constitutional system? No pressure there on that one.
So far, I'm afraid, I think it's created the possibilities. It hasn't, right? To some extent, the question answers itself. On reconstructing the constitutional system, it's made imaginable kinds of claims that really seemed at the outside the what political scientists call the Overton window, just sort of, or what constitutional law mavens sometimes call off the wall. Would have been off the wall to talk about the kinds of sort of provision, for Americans out of work, provision for families, provision for, not losing your home to eviction, and the kind of enormous spending that was thought to be off the table in the name of, right, putting a floor on people's, right, economic insecurity. So that there are clearly many things that are on the table in virtue of what we've been through and the movements that have emerged. And the very fact that there are people now, right, with playing a heavy part in areas like antitrust, who are talking, in sort of rich and informed ways about antitrust's role, as Joey was saying, in taking down corporate concentrations of wealth because they exercise too much political power. That's a sea change. Whether that moves forward into actually rebuilding and reconstructing, reinventing institutions will depend on what lies ahead, right?
Yeah, and I think obviously the pandemic we basically had a universal child allowance for a brief time. And that's the kind of policy that I think Willie's talking about that would have been hard to imagine that was really on the table pre-pandemic as a serious policy that anybody but the left, fringe of the Democratic Party would have favored, but it got majority and indeed bipartisan support as a temporary pandemic measure and reduced child poverty enormously in a way that had very big racial inequality implications, and which those implications were part of what, why we did it. And yet, the Democratic Congress that has the thinnest majority let it lapse. I mean, whatever, Joe Manchin, et cetera, it didn't quite have enough votes to continue. And now we have a national experiment in what happens when you go back to not having a massive reduction in child poverty. So, I think it did exactly as we said. It moved the Overton window. I think there was a kind of like 1990s liberal kind of attitude about, or moderate liberal, a sort of Clintonian maybe attitude about, the market is mainly something that you just let the market take care of things. And then around the edges, government intervention can help with problems that arise and certain externalities and stuff. It's a very econ inflected view of what government is there to do. I think that somebody from the 90s would have been pretty shocked at all that government did in response to the pandemic. And there's a way that it might help open a more of a conversation about in most of American history, before there was economics, there was political economy. That's what in the book we're trying to kind of be part of this reviving of the term political economy. And it's a broader way of thinking than economics because it brings political institutions much more into the story and the interaction between economic matters and political matters. There's a lot that we need to do, some of which we have tried. I think there's still the danger that, as has often happened in previous rounds of fighting about inequality in this country, racism can be used successfully as a political wedge to block building a more kind of broad redistributive society, because politically that often seems to be a powerful wedge. This is why in the book we argue that basically the Reconstruction Republicans were right, that you can't do racial inclusion and economic inequality separately. You have to link these together. And I think that insight is one that we now have one political party that actually at least sees it. And so I think there's a lot of history not yet written about how far the Democrats will get with it.
So when it's, to sort of reach back and tie a couple threads together as swiftly as I can, it wasn't the court packing plan that sort of halted the New Deal in its tracks before it could get done. It was the reactionary racist core of the Democratic Party itself making common cause with conservative Republicans and throwing up obstacles to any further New Deal reform, particularly racial inclusion, but far from only that, also throwing up obstacles and finally cutting down much of the labor protections that had been constructed. That was right. That had to do with mass disenfranchisement of Black America and this Dixiecrat, the most reactionary racist elements being part of the New Deal coalition. The Democratic Party is no longer saddled with that. Democratic Party is no longer beholden to a group that wants to keep up Black disenfranchisement. Quite the contrary. And so in that respect, the situation is unprecedented in terms of there being mass economic pain and great anxiety about the sort of the vanishing of stable middle class opportunities. And at the same time, a party that, however big the chore is, that sort of embraces a good portion of working America, Black and white, and with a more robust, economic program can draw in many, many more, right? And it can't do so at the expense of racial and sex equality. It can only do it by holding these two things together.
Thank you for that. And, one of the things I want to bring us to is some of the audience questions here. We got a lot of great audience questions in the chat here. And again, as a reminder for those tuning in, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. We'll try our best to get to the question. We're not going to get at everyone, but really appreciate it. And, one of the questions that we have is really, there's this question and conversation, just like we were just talking about around race and some of the sacrifices that were made, the compromises that were made that excluded Black Americans, other people of color. There are some that talk about the Constitution as a framework that is built by wealthy slaveholders and other well-to-do figures to protect slavery from abolitionism and wealth from redistribution from Democratic majorities. So given this fact, how can it be that this same framework can work for the ideas that you've all sketched out here in your book?
Glad you asked the question. I hope Joey will forgive me if I take the first pass at it.
Yeah.
One of the fascinating things about the kind of creation of the U.S. Constitution, which to be sure, right, was the handiwork of slaveholders and a wealthy, right, and members of a wealthy elite, is that they had to, these white gentlemen who gathered in Philadelphia had to engage with, right, a broad, right, swath of white working men, right, of white guys in the first instance, right, who were very skeptical of their project and well understood that part of the project was to, right, centralize power that can, in order to subdue the far more radical, far more small d democratic constitutions that then exist at the state level. And the part of that sort of process gave us the Bill of Rights as a set of safeguards to secure a greater measure of popular participation and state level politics. And part of what happened in the fight over whether to ratify this elite, right, piece of handiwork was that arguments that were at first, right, part and parcel of the opposition to the Constitution became instead arguments about how to interpret it. This was the origins of our first political parties. It was a huge battle. The battle that was over whether to ratify this document about which white working men had grave doubts morphed into a battle about what it meant. And that brought a lot of the most dramatic anti-oligarchy themes squarely into, right, how we interpret the Constitution. And as some of the great founding fathers who originally wanted to see this more centralized, more elite version of Republican government, right, drew back from what they created and founded the opposition, became the leaders of the opposition. So that baked into the project from the beginning was this Jeffersonian account that drew on a very strong anti-oligarchy thread that had originally opposed the Constitution as a piece of, right, as a piece of aristocratic oligarchy work. In respect of them having been slaveholders, right, that is profoundly true. In the end, that was the contradiction that, right, broke it apart and required a second founding. And a second founding, which, as Joey said, picked up the language of oligarchy. We didn't just say, oh, this looks like they're talking about oligarchy. They said they were talking about oligarchy. It was their language, the spirit of oligarchy, that sort of on which the sort of political economy of the Southern slaveholders rested, said the Republicans in Reconstruction has to be broken. And that involves not just civil and political rights for Black America. It involves a new political economy. That political economy was a far cry from the New Deal, but you get the story. At each step, chiefly political actors and parties, right, made claims on what the Constitution requires to remain a democratic and Republican enterprise over time.
Just to add one little kind of methodological window into what we're doing here. Part of what we are doing in the book is we're tracing a tradition of people who are, exactly as Willie says, borrowing from prior generations of arguments about the Constitution and adapting them. And so, the Reconstruction Republicans had a much different and radical project about race relations that, as compared to what, Thomas Jefferson was going to countenance, but still saw some of the ideas as useful and important. And they thought, we actually do need to worry about the political economy of the society that we're trying to reconstruct and build. And they thought we have to break up, plantations, we have to distribute land to the freed slaves, or else they are going to become dependent and not able to kind of stand on their own feet and be full citizens. There needs to be an economic redistribution to make that happen. And also schools, they need to build Black, schools throughout the South. All of this is necessary to kind of redeem the ideas from the Constitution in a way that that they could make work to abolish slavery and the Southern oligarchy. So the story that we tell is not necessarily one that like a strict originalist would say, like, oh, let's look back and keep the meaning of the Constitution exactly where it was when it started. We think there is a lot of useful anti-oligarchy meaning in the Constitution as enacted, especially in the 1860s, but there's also a story that we want to tell about a tradition that evolves with time as Americans in the courts and outside the courts and in Congress and in states kind of make claims on the Constitution. And those claims are all authentically, we think, kind of part of our tradition that should be able to be drawn on today as we make our arguments today.
Great, and certainly not to seed the ground by which many of these claims are made. I think that's a really helpful frame to think about it. Got another question here from Jeffrey. Talks about the overarching problem behind economic inequalities, some of the dissatisfaction among large parts of society that leads to some of these dissatisfied groups voting for representatives and senators and also state level reps that are not really up to the task of tackling major problems facing the country. Can you all speak to some of this, the linkages here that we're seeing about economic inequality, people voting for those who maybe aren't ready to take up these challenges?
I don't know if this is quite the connection that this questioner was making, but I do think there's an interesting connection that may be what he's asking about, which is, a big part of the success of the recent populist right has been to kind of harness a dissatisfaction, a kind of broad economic dissatisfaction among white, working class voters in particular, and harness that to say, instead of focusing on our economic oligarchy problem, let's focus instead on sort of, ivory tower liberals and liberal courts and maybe celebrities and Hollywood, sort of reorient what the thing is that we should care about. And I think it's a central political task of anyone who is progressive and wants to actually kind of orient people's sense of where the political power lies to show these voters that actually, the political power is being held by an oligarchy that people 100 years ago would have understood, not some kind of newfangled thing where Hollywood assumes outsized importance.
No, and I think that's helpful too, just kind of in framing around the questions about who's in power and who's controlling what. There is an argument here. One of the questions that I think it ties a little bit into this past one, but there's these arguments here that are dependent on there's a lot of conversation here about progressives kind of taking to push some of these more progressive policies forward for progressive causes. But one of the readers here, or the viewers here, says that you don't seem to be making the argument necessarily that we need to fix the Constitution itself. Are you not necessarily arguing that we are already living under an oligarchy by making that argument? Who wants to take that one? Yeah,
that's a great and important question. And the short answer is we are entirely open to the possibility that just as just as in the progressive era, when capital P progressivism was afoot, right? Many people, sort of from the radical left through right to the sort of most mainstream of capital P progressives, figures like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and all the way to the left, figures like Eugene Debs, the great socialist leader, absolutely said the greatest impediments, or some of them, to enacting progressive reform and redistribution and regulating this economy are baked into the structure of the Constitution and needs to be changed. They said, on some iterations, we need to directly elect our senators, and other iterations, we need to get rid of the Senate, right? We need to address the Electoral College. We need to take down the constitutional power of the court to strike down legislation. All kinds of dramatic, radical constitutional structural changes were on the table. And our point is that even then, the way they made their arguments ran through, making claims on the Constitution considered as, resting on the principles of, anti-oligarchy, a broad distribution of wealth and power, a middle class big enough to accommodate everybody, and sometimes at their best, racial inclusion. But at the very least, they were saying, in order to redeem the principles that this Constitution was built on, we need to dramatically change its structures. We shouldn't, again, cede the Constitution, to the reactionaries. And we shouldn't expect to kind of prevail and build the kind of supermajorities you need to enact structural reforms. Let's not forget that it's well and good to say it's some of the hardwired features of the Constitution that are deeply part of the problem. But the question then is, how are you going to change that? And if that requires amendments, how are you going to build those majorities? Probably not by saying, we've got a untested theory of democracy we'd like the American people in their masses to sign up for, in lieu of the constitutional democracy we've got and needs, serious repair.
And actually, it brings a question around what we're seeing right now in many state legislatures all across the country, where they are certainly acting in many ways contrary to some of these broader conversations, especially when it comes to things around gerrymandering, which impacts the types of ability to elect the representatives that are accountable to people. Given that landscape, given the landscape that we speak to, both kind of thinking about progressives majorities at maybe a federal level, but given the landscape in states all across the country, how do you envision how we move forward in this space when it comes to these conversations about the Constitution?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really practical and important question. And like progressives a century ago, I think we today should be just cognizant of where is there some leverage through which we can use democracy to promote democracy. Where is there some leverage where it's possible? And I think currently, we're about 2 or 3 senators short. The Democrats are about 2 or 3 senators short in the Senate today from being able to enact through legislation, a major, I think, constitutionally necessary set of reforms that would actually force states to change some of the gerrymandering practices that you were just talking about and actually make state legislatures more democratic. That's the kind of thing we argue that Congress can do in the name of the Anti-Oligarchy Constitution and its ideals, even though what they're actually doing is not changing the federal constitution through amendment, it's enacting statutes or taking other actions. I saw, there was one of the questions here. I'm glancing out of the corner of my eye. I saw there was somebody who asked me about the filibuster. It's another good example of there are a lot of undemocratic features of our current political order that are not even actually in the Constitution. To change them is a matter of political will and persuasive political argument. And some of those arguments have to do with redeeming the ideals that we can draw from the Constitution itself. Now, why should we do that? Why shouldn't we just say, these are good democratic ideals for any society? And often that may be true, but I think it matters that they're ours too, because it helps to show that, we're not saying, let's make the United States more like Western European democracy, or something like that. We're just saying, let's live up to our own ideals, and let's do that through whatever reforms there's kind of the practical leverage to make, which could involve the courts. More likely in the near term today is going to instead involve Congress with the courts kicking and screaming all the way. And, the question of whether you change features of our current political order, like the gerrymandering in the states or like the counter-majoritarian filibuster in rules in the Senate, or even maybe the Electoral College, can be potentially changed through actions that don't necessarily involve the Article 5 amendment process.
We're coming close to time. And so I wanted you both to really answer kind of a final question, which is really, what do you want readers to take away from this book? I mean, we talked about a lot of really great, important topics and discussion points. What are you hoping for readers to take away from this book?
I think the important thing to take away is two things, and they can both, or can be one sentence long, so Joey can have a chance. One of them is the project of interpreting the Constitution belongs to everybody, and as as movements, Americans can reshape what the Constitution means and requires. And second, just as a brute fact of the matter, our constitutional democracy can't endure with the kinds of economic inequality we labor under today.
Yeah, that's terrific. I would, maybe if I add a little more, I would just add that, the idea of building a more inclusive democracy has an economic component and it has a political component. We can do a lot through politics to build the constitutional order that looks more like what we could recognize as a constitutional order that fulfills the ideals that we find in our tradition. And so I think that progressives shouldn't shy away from constitutional arguments. They shouldn't look at them as just as just handing power over to courts. Instead, by making those arguments in politics, I think we can build a world in which we don't have to just live with whatever this current right-wing Supreme Court decides. We actually can change it.
Well, thank you both for such a fascinating conversation. Joseph, William, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all for attending today's conversation. More information can be found about the Anti-Oligarchy Constitution can be found in your chat window. Sarah shared that in the chat. Books are available as well, bookstores nationwide and online. So be sure to get your copy. Our thanks again to NYU's John Bradimus Center. And I'm Kyle Strickland. Really appreciate you all for joining us. But thanks again, Joseph and William. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great.